it's Doug Kay. Welcome to another episode of All About the Gear with Mr. Gordon Lang from Brighton, England. How are you, Gordon?
I'm very good, Doug. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, you're always welcome. You're always welcome. You're going to be taking a little bit of a vacation, as people on that continent named. Well, you're almost on the continent. You're near the continent.
We're connected by a tunnel.
That's true. That's true.
Yes.
There's actually a physical connection now that didn't used to exist.
There is. I use that physical connection frequently. It's brilliant. Actually, here's a quick advert for Eurotunnel. €50 approximately each way, and you can take a vehicle with up to 8 people in it. I've stopped flying. I've stopped going on holidays flying to go on holidays. Brilliant. I love all the continental road trips. So it's such an affordable way to take the family away.
Do people pick up hitchhikers, or do they ride share in order to share the cost when they go across?
They're probably quite wary about that. The border control is quite strict on you giving lifts to people intentionally or unintentionally, so it's best not to do that. But it's so cheap, you don't need to do it. You drive your car onto a train. The train takes about just over half an hour to cross the channel, and then you pop up in Calais in France, which is fantastic.
Oh, great. All right. I'm looking forward to that. I haven't been over there I've been there, but I haven't experienced that. So today we have as you have written, a much rumored and much anticipated camera that's out there. The megapixel wars are back with a vengeance. And today we're going to look at the Canon 5DS, which I think, at least in 35 millimeter format, full frame format, is now, as of this moment, I should check my clock, is the megapixel leader, if I'm not mistaken.
It certainly is. And in fact, more megapixels than some medium format cameras as well. It has 50.6 megapixels. I'm trying to show the camera here, but it's somewhat obscured by the enormous lens I have mounted on it that we're going to talk a bit more about later in the show. This is the EF 11 to 24 millimeter ultra wide angle, but behind it is the EOS 5DS, which looks a great deal like the EOS 5D Mark III, and I'll be talking a bit more about that in just a moment. But yes, this is the highest resolution 35 millimeter format camera that's currently available. If you think about it, 50.6 megapixels. Below that, you've got the 36 megapixels of the Nikon D810 and Sony A7R. Of course, Sony's A7R Mark II, which was announced shortly after the EOS 5DS, kind of slots in between those resolutions with 42 megapixels, but still doesn't quite touch 50.6. So if you want bragging rights, the 5DS is the camera for you. And it's worth pointing out at this point that Canon do 2 versions of this camera. They do the EOS 5DS and the EOS 5DS-R, and it's pretty much the same strategy that Nikon did with the original D800 and D800. Crikey, I've forgotten what letter they put after it. What did they call that?
Which one? The Nikon?
Yeah, they did 2 versions of the D800. One with
D800E.
That's right. Now, what they did with those cameras is they have an optical low-pass filter in front of, in the sensor stack. And in order to get rid of that effect, they then put another filter in front of that, which actually eliminates the effect of an optical low-pass filter. So what Nikon did originally with the D800D is it didn't actually remove the low-pass filter, it eliminated the effect of it, and that's what Canon have done here. Now, it's different to what Nikon have done subsequently with the D810 and what Sony do with the A7R Mark II, which is it actually doesn't have an optical low-pass filter. Why do I keep mentioning optical low-pass filters? It's because these camera sensors actually have a little blurring filter in front of them to eliminate or reduce the effect of moire on repeating patterns. But when the resolution gets so high on these sensors, and if you're not shooting subjects with very fine repeating patterns, then you might think, why am I going for this ultimate resolution and then deliberately blurring it? So that's why they do 2 versions of this camera. So this one here, the 5DS, which is ideal for general purpose use. And then if you are confident that your subjects mostly don't contain fine patterns, then you could go for the 5DSR, or of course manage that moire yourself later in post.
Well, it's hard to imagine that you could eliminate the effect of a filter by putting on another filter and keep it from blurring. I'll take your word for it.
And should we do some prices now, Doug? The 5DS, which is the one I'm holding here, body alone is $3,699 US, or 2,999 Great British pounds. If you want the EOS 5DS-R, That counteracting filter is going to cost you an extra $200 or £200, so $38.99. Just for comparison, the D810 currently retails for $3,000. So if I get rid of the 99, you're looking at about an extra $700 between the 5DS and the D810. And Sony's A7R Mark II is coming in at $3,200. So that's roughly in between, which is, you're probably paying approximately the same amount per megapixel then. So D810 with 36 megapixels is 3,000. A7R Mark II with 42 megapixels is 3,200. And the EOS 5DS with 50.6 megapixels is 3,700 or 3,900 if you want the 5DSR version.
Well, you know, dollars, or I should say pennies per pixel, these are a bargain. And especially since these pixels are reusable, they don't go away once you shoot with them, which is pretty nice. We should also mention the original Sony A7R, which is still a contender. The A7R Mark II has such incredible improvements that I'm not sure anybody should even consider the A7R, but that A7R original is $800 less expensive than this camera and down to about $1,900 US. And
that's amazing. That's a 36 megapixel full frame camera. That's very, very small. I mean, it'd be rude not to.
Yeah, and I want to mention real quickly about some of the disadvantages. I had that camera. Many people have used that camera successfully. I think one of the biggest problems they had was problems with shutter vibration. So the initial shutter, which has to close and then open in order to make the exposure, that initial shutter was causing the thing to vibrate, even when on a fairly sturdy tripod. And this is something that has been almost entirely cured with the A7R Mark II, not the least of which is the elimination of the need to have that opening shutter. You can actually do that fully electronically now. So anyway, that was a big issue with the A7R that a lot of people had an issue with.
And that brings us on neatly to some of the features on the 5DS, because when I originally tested the 5D Mark III, when it came out about 3 years prior to this, it was alongside the D810, and the biggest difference that I noticed between those two cameras was that in order to enjoy the extra resolution of the D810, so let's kind of backtrack here. The 5D Mark III had 22.3 megapixels, and the D810 had 36, so the D800 and the D810 after that had 36 megapixels. Now, I found when I was out shooting with both of those cameras, handheld, shooting casually with the viewfinder-based AF systems, which, lest we forget, can suffer from some front and back focusing issues with some lenses if you don't calibrate them, I found that I wasn't actually noticing much benefit in resolution from the D800 and D810 files. Where were those extra 12 or 14 megapixels going, I was wondering. Then I put both cameras on tripods. I focused in live view, thereby bypassing any front or back focusing issues. I used mirror lockup, all of the tricks that you can do to keep the camera as steady as possible. And that's when I really noticed the difference between the 5D Mark III and the D800, D810. And with the 5DS, it shouldn't come as any surprise that it's even more susceptible to your technique. You have to be very, very careful about how you shoot with this camera in order to get the best from it. You need to shoot with the best quality lenses that you can. For example, the 11 to 24 millimeter is a fantastic match for this camera, a very, very sharp, high resolution lens. But beyond that, you need to shoot at an optimal aperture, which for this lens I found was about f5.6, not f8. f8 was still very good, but f5.6 was a little bit sharper in some of my outdoor tests with this camera. Then you've got to use a self-timer or a cable release. You definitely want to be using mirror lockup. And you also want to be using the live view focusing so that what you see on the screen is exactly what you're going to be getting from the sensor. And when all of these things come together, this camera is capable of delivering epic files with a massive amount of detail, which is, after all, what it's for. But if you're going to be wandering around shooting with this camera handheld, in a street type environment, then you're probably not going to see, unless you're very lucky, the full benefit of the resolution of this camera. You will see a benefit, but for me, I think I'd probably sooner shoot a 5D Mark III if I was going to be doing mostly handheld. This camera, the 5DS and the 5DSR, are really for people who are shooting on tripods very carefully, landscape shooters, architecture, product photography, of course, all of those things. And in a certain type of studio environment, certain types of portraiture as well, but I wouldn't say the more ad hoc wedding type photography. If it's more kind of formal portraiture, then you may do quite well with this. But it's important to think about how you're going to use these cameras. I know a lot of people just want the biggest number available, but they may not get the most out of this camera depending on how they shoot.
Yeah. Now, when I owned a Nikon D800E, I owned a Sony A7R, and I considered them both to be tripod-only cameras. Part of that was just the vibration issues. Part of it was just the size of the files. I didn't really need 36 megapixels unless I was doing landscape work or something like that. But I noticed in your review, you pointed out the fact that the pixel pitch of this sensor is really the same as in the 7D Mark III. And we often... What's that?
7D Mark II.
Sorry, the 7D Mark II. That's right. And we often talk about the problems of diffraction that a lot of people aren't aware of. We talk about things with tiny pixels and where you stop down, you think you're going to get a sharper image, but in fact, you start to defeat the purpose. And something I always like to point out to people with these densely packed pixel sensors, that you need to watch out for that. Now, I don't know, you said f5.6 looked great with that 11 to 24. I don't know if you were starting to hit diffraction or you think it was an optical issue with the lens itself.
It's hard to tell, but what I would really encourage all people who are pixel peepers, and there's nothing wrong in being a pixel peeper, if you are really into getting the best quality out of your system, do yourself a favor one day, put it on a tripod with your favorite lenses and take the same shot. Make sure that the subject is at the same distance, or infinity is great if you can do a landscape. Take a picture at all aperture settings, focus on the same point, and open them up and have a look at them. One of the first things that's worth looking at, if the subject isn't moving and if the depth of field doesn't change because it's a distant subject, look at the actual file sizes of the JPEGs, because you'll find that they actually go up and down like a bell curve, and they correspond to the amount of detail, because the JPEG compression engine literally can't. If you're saying, look, I want you to retain that detail, it's going to say, well, I'm going to have to use more storage space. It's going to have to be a bigger file. So quite a good approximate indicator of where that peak is the largest file for your JPEGs. But of course, as you're stopping it down, the depth of field is getting larger and you're getting more things in focus, more detail there. And if, for example, like me, you shoot by the seaside, then the sea is moving and there's birds in the air. So it's not an absolute guide, but it does actually give you quite a good idea. But you'll be able to see when you open all of those images up in, say, Photoshop and you tile them, you will see that there is a peak, again, a bell curve, where the lenses generally begin to get sharper and then they become softer again. And that peak could be due to the optical design, it could be due to diffraction, but it's worth getting to know where that peak is for your various lenses and various cameras, because if you want to get the best out of them, shooting at the optimal aperture is very, very important.
Yeah, I think the key here is that smaller apertures, tighter apertures are not always sharper images. And that's, like Gordon says, it's important to check it out for yourself, because the combination of the lens and the camera is going to make quite a bit of difference. Now, we're going to come back. We're going to talk about image quality as the ultimate question here, but tell us first about the handling of the camera. How does this camera different? Those who might have a 5D Mark II or Mark III, what are the differences other than this sensor?
Well, if you were to ask who is the 5DS for, then it is really for people who loved the 5D Mark III but wished it had more megapixels. And I have a 5D Mark III here. And I would ask you to spot the difference. If I show the cameras from multiple angles, here they are from the front and from the sides, and it's almost identical. You really have to have them next to each other to tell the difference physically. I will point out those differences in just a moment, but that basically answers who this camera is for. It's for someone who's got a 5D Mark III and wants to pick up a camera without having to relearn it. All the buttons, the same buttons are there. They're in the same places. They do exactly the same thing. So you could pick up this camera if you're familiar with the Mark III and start shooting with it straight away. It's effectively a 5D Mark III with a bigger sensor, but there are a couple of small differences. If we have a look underneath the camera, so in my left hand, the one I'm waving at the moment is the 5DS, and in my other hand, the right hand, is the 5D Mark III. Now, I want you to have a look at the tripod area, the plate, the area around the tripod thread is different. Now, Canon has actually put some effort into making it kind of more secure and stable on the 5DS. It's really, really realizes that how you mount this camera is very important for getting the best results. When you go to the menus, you'll also notice that while the 5D Mark III did have a mirror lockup function, it was either enabled or disabled. On the 5DS, when you enable it, you get the choice of delaying it by almost any number of seconds. You can do it by a fraction of a second, by a whole second, by 2 seconds. So you can really configure the mirror lockup on it. So you can see little differences like that. Also, Canon has modified the shutter mechanism, which is more like the 7D Mark II. So it's kind of motor-driven, motor-assisted. And that also makes a different sound. Now, I know a lot of people are interested in how these cameras sound, so I'm going to hold the camera near to where I believe my microphone is. Doug, please let me know if you can't hear anything.
Okay.
I believe it's here. It's part of my headset. So here we go. This is the 5DS. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Slightly electronic sound, slightly motorized sound, as you'd expect. Here is the 5D Mark III. Slightly more mechanical and louder, but also more of a slap. There is more of a slap to this, whereas on the 5DS it's kind of more damped, which is again what you want. All these little things that could trip you up when you're trying to achieve the maximum detail. They're really trying hard. But equally, there's a couple of things that have been left out, which are quite notable by their absence. The 5D Mark III, famously, even though it's 3 years old, is one of the best cameras for shooting 1080p video because the frame is exactly divisible by 3, so there's no scaling artifacts. Well, the 5DS also shoots 1080p. Unfortunately, it's still only up to 30p in Canon's world. That's absolutely fine. But what they've done, if you look at the ports on the side, they've taken out the headphone socket. Now, this is a camera that is physically virtually identical to the 5D Mark III, so this was a conscious decision. It wasn't that they designed a new camera and went, you know what, shall we put the headphone socket in or not? What they've done is deliberately taken it out, which is quite an unusual move. They're saying this camera will do video, but it's not as optimized for video as the 5D Mark III, or hopefully in the future, maybe there'll be a 5D Mark IV or a 4K version. If you open up the ports as well, you'll notice that what they've done here, so this is where the headphone jack was on the 5D Mark III. Now, if you're listening to the podcast, I'm actually opened up to one of the flaps, and you can only see 2 ports here. Now, on the 5D Mark III, there were 3 ports. One of them was a headphone jack. But you'll also notice, if you're familiar with the 5D Mark III, that the USB port has changed here. It's actually a USB 3 socket on this camera compared to USB 2 on the 5D Mark III. So there's little subtle differences between them. But really, they're pretty much the same. They have the same autofocus system as well, which was very good on the 5D Mark III. I was shooting with it quite recently when I was testing a large Sigma telephoto zoom, and I'd forgotten exactly how good it was, because you imagine the 5D Mark III is a kind of high-quality camera, which isn't necessarily a sporty or a fast camera, but it actually performs very well. The 5DS has got the same AF system, but it doesn't shoot quite as fast because of those massive files. And I was just doing some continuous autofocus tests with it just before recording this show, and I noticed it did slow down a little bit more when you were using AI Servo, which is the continuous AF mode. So you're not going to use the 5DS as a sports camera. And again, if you're into video, you may do better with the 5D Mark III, or indeed something like the A7R Mark II, or almost any number of Panasonic cameras which now offer 4K video. Unfortunately, Canon is still not offering 4K video in this kind of form factor. So the more you learn about the 5DS, the more you kind of really realize that it's just about resolution. It's really about getting the biggest files you can. And if you're wondering about size, if you're recording large, fine JPEGs on the 5DS, they're about 25 megabytes, and RAW files are about 75 megabytes. So if, like me, you shoot RAW plus JPEG, you're looking at about 100 megabytes per frame, effectively, which is a load of data to store.
And so it's clear that for this model, they've essentially tried to make it hard to use video by restricting the video modes, by limiting that headphone jack. I know from your written review that they also don't have a clean HDMI output, which I believe means that you can't get just the image. You get essentially everything that you would get on the rear LCD. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's important because a lot of people like to connect external recorders to them and record the feed in a less compressed format or in a different format. They like to use external recorders. However, I should say that they have at least still offered the two different types of video compression. You can record it in IPB or all-I compression. What all-I does is it's less compressed. It's recording an actual a whole frame by itself for each frame in the sequence, as opposed to IPB that looks within the sequence and goes, you know what? I noticed there's blue sky, multiple frames there. I only need to compress that once for about 5 frames worth. So it saves space that way, whereas all-I actually looks at each frame at a time and effectively records each one separately, which makes it also quicker for editing, but it makes the data rates much, much higher. I was filming little kind of 15, 20-second clips, and they were coming in at, say, 50, 70 megabytes in IPB, but about 250 megabytes in all-I. So, you know, again, it depends how much space you've got on your memory card, but at least that option is there. But if you want to connect it to an external recorder, again, you'll be better off with products like the 5D Mark III, or again, outside of Canon's world, almost anything by Sony or Panasonic.
So it seems pretty obvious that if you're committed to the Canon product line, if you own quite a few good Canon lenses and you want to move into this high megapixel, high resolution world, that this 5DS or 5DSR are probably a pretty good choice. But let's assume you're starting from scratch and you don't have an investment in these lines. I know you don't have these cameras side by side, so you can't really do an A-B-C comparison, but how would you compare the image quality of this camera to the A7R Mark II and the Nikon D810, which are both, 36 megapixels, 42 megapixels, 50 megapixels? It's not that big a difference. So what do you think?
Well, it's easy to talk about the D810 because I have tested it. That camera has been out for some time, so I can comment on that. The files are actually bigger than you expect, and especially compared to the 5D Mark III, although to be fair, it's almost double the number of total megapixels. You really do notice the difference when you open up these images in Photoshop and you look at them 100%. So long as, again, you're using good quality lenses and your technique's being careful, you will notice more detail on the Canon. Now, the one I can't comment on is the A7R Mark II, simply because at the time we recorded this video, final production samples were not quite available, so I've not been able to test that camera as thoroughly as I'd like to. I will, of course, very, very soon, and by the time you watch this video, I may even have some comparison results at cameralabs.com, so please do check that out because that's where all my latest information will be. I would say, well, obviously, the difference is going to be more subtle between the A7R Mark II and the 5DS. There's only 8 megapixels in between them. I'm really not comfortable in calling it until I've actually put them side by side. But they're going to be quite close. Unless Sony's really messed up that sensor, they're going to be quite close, aren't they? What's more interesting, though, to me, are the additional features on the A7R Mark II, which, lest we forget, is also a cheaper camera than the 5DS. You're getting 4K video. You're also getting 1080p at 60p. Whereas on the 5DS, you only get it at 30p. You're getting an electronic viewfinder, which has pros and cons compared to an optical viewfinder. We've discussed that at length before. But if you're filming video, it's obviously a useful thing to have because you cannot compose or replay video on an optical viewfinder. Things like focus peaking, features that you really take for granted on a lot of cameras now that yet are not present on things like the 5DS. Also, now we're talking about it, no Wi-Fi, which to me was a typical bizarre Canon decision that they don't put it on. Yes, you can get an adapter for it, but I don't want an adapter. I don't want to buy an accessory that costs a few $100s and have it hanging off the side where it can get knocked off or lost or that I have to remember. I want it built in. And sure, I know that might compromise the integrity of the body. It may not be as tough, but I just wish they'd put it in. It seems a really funny thing to miss out on a camera of this class in 2015. If you're going to release a $3,000 to $4,000 camera in 2015, that, if we look at Canon's product cycle, is going to be a camera that's current until at least 2018, and it doesn't have Wi-Fi, to me, that's a big issue. To some people, it's not an issue at all. To me, it is a big issue. I use Wi-Fi all the time to transfer images onto my phone, for sharing, for backup, for remote control, for all sorts of things. I find it very, very useful. But equally, I appreciate there's plenty of people out there who couldn't care less. But still, it's missing out for a camera that is a real flagship product. It's missing out on a lot of things. And to also hobble it, apparently deliberately, for video, really gnaws at me. I think, again, a lot of people who are landscape still shooters, they go, I don't care about video either. You know, all I want is those big files, and that's perfect. But there's nothing wrong in putting in those extra features. You know, why deliberately annoy a potential market or a potential customer? And more importantly, drive them onto another product. And I think this is interesting because a lot of things have happened in the 3 years since the 5D Mark III. So Canon comes out with the 5D Mark III, 20-odd megapixels. Nikon comes out with the D810, 36 megapixels. And immediately there's this kind of tensional battle between the Canon and Nikon camps. There's the Canon owners who go, oh, ours is lower resolution, so it's going to have a greater tonal dynamic range and lower noise. It's superior in that regard. And the Nikon people go, yeah, but I'm a landscape shooter. I'm shooting on a tripod at 100 ISO. I couldn't care less about high ISO performance. Look at my megapixels. Look at the detail that I'm getting here. And the Canon owners are going, yeah, actually, that's right. You know, I wish I had a high resolution option. Meanwhile, Canon is not producing a higher resolution camera for years and years and years. So a few people are beginning to move camp to Nikon, especially as Nikon also has the 14 to 24 2.8, this high quality ultra wide lens. There's a Canon landscape shooters are going, I want this ultra wide lens, I want this high resolution file. Canon, you're not giving it to me. Then a short while later, Sony comes out with the A7R and says, well, look, here's 36 megapixels. Oh, and by the way, Canon people, you can adapt your lenses and put them on. So, you know, you could buy this body and actually use your lenses. Sure, there's some compromise. The autofocus will be very slow, blah, blah, blah. But suddenly you've got 36 megapixels. So I think Canon lost a few people to Sony then. And during this time, there must have been a meeting in Canon's HQ where they went, you know what? It's all very well having this belief that 20 megapixels, approximately 20, is this sweet spot for noise levels. Because remember, until this year, they didn't have anything higher than 18 on APS-C when everyone else was at 24. And on full frame, they didn't have anything higher than about 22. So now they've changed that. And in 2015, we've now gone to 24 megapixels on APS-C and now up to 50 megapixels on full frame. And they finally I think they finally understood that they were losing customers to Nikon and Sony. So they've responded with that. And also with the 11 to 24 millimeter lens that we can talk about whenever you like. So they're now finally, I think, responding to a situation that started about 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting because a couple of comments I have there. One, you know, having shot with the original Nikon D800 and D800E, where I was committed to them only being used on a tripod. Then they came out with the 810, and I was actually very surprised because the D810 was a much better all-around multi-purpose camera. It still had the high resolution, but they solved a lot of the issues that I think kept it from being a general-purpose camera. Autofocus, all sorts of things like that were improved on the 810. And then you look at Sony. So Nikon's in their second iteration. The D810 came out rather quickly after the D800, I think because people recognized there were a lot of problems with the original model. So now Sony comes out with the A7R, as you pointed out, followed relatively quickly by Canon standards with the A7R Mark II, which we're supposed to ship in the next 30 days. The A7R Mark II, as you pointed out earlier, is already $500 cheaper than the Canon. With an adapter, a good adapter is going to cost you hundreds of dollars. But again, you'll be able to use those Canon lenses, and this time supposedly with autofocus. So I know a number of people who have, especially landscape shooters, they switched to the Sony A7R body because of the features they like there better, and because Canon didn't have a high-res sensor, high-res body. And now they've got the choice of staying in that Sony body camp, continuing to use the Canon lenses, and now gaining autofocus, plus all the advantages that we're expecting to see in the A7R Mark II. So Canon is Canon is slow there. I'm not sure quite why they are. Also, you mentioned the video. Now, it's okay. We can give them a pass on the fact that this isn't a great video camera. They're just not going after that market with this. That's fine. But, Canon really put the idea of 35 millimeter format cameras being used for video. They put that on the map with the original 5D, I think. And Panasonic, of course, is a leader there. But I worry about Canon being able to hold on to that lead that they had in the beginning.
Yeah, so lest we forget, again, that's the third time I've said lest we forget. It's one of my favorite phrases. That was the fourth time. The 5D Mark II introduced 1080p video on the full frame format. And like you said, it was adopted by filmmakers around the world. They absolutely loved the idea of being able to, stick on an f1.2 lens and get this incredibly shallow depth of field, incredibly low noise in low light. And it's like Canon come up with this amazing technology and then kind of either get bored with it or do something else. What they did with the movie line is they kind of went higher end. So the cinema cameras, which offer 4K now, and some of them have got dual pixel CMOS AF. But on the 5D line, it's like they've kind of gone, whatever. And I don't know if any company can afford to do that. And the interesting thing about the A7R Mark II is I did test a pre-production sample. You were asking me about image quality. I can't talk about that. I can, however, talk about my experience with a pre-production sample in terms of autofocus. Now, on the A7R Mark I, if you're using the Metabone Smart Adapter, it would autofocus, but it was slow. I mean, you're looking at like like that. Fine if you're on a tripod and you're shooting a landscape, but for everything else, it's pretty much unusable. However, with the A7R Mark II, they've got an embedded phase detector AF system on the sensor that works much faster, and with the same Metabones adapter, and I only got to test one Canon lens with it, and here's the big caveat, it was one that Sony actually had with them at a press event. I'm not suggesting that they modified it. I don't think they would do that. However, they may have tested multiple lenses and found that this one was the best one. But I can tell you that with at least one Canon lens, it focuses very, very, very quickly. It focuses as quickly as any Canon body does in live view, faster in fact. And I've got a video preview of that A7R Mark II at cameralabs.com where I test it with that lens. It's the 24mm, was it the STM or the USM? I think it was the USM. Anyway, either way, it was literally going like that. It was focusing sufficiently fast for you to use this handheld, for you to actually go, I'm going to point it at that. Oh, there's something happening there, and get the picture. And that is a big difference compared to the A7R. And again, when you're looking at that experience and the benefit of having a smaller body and video and Wi-Fi and everything else that it's got in there at a cheaper price. And as you said, people who were maybe tempted to buy into Sony because of getting better compatibility with Canon lenses may have also discovered that Zeiss has been producing some absolutely awesome lenses for the Sony system, the native system. I absolutely love the Loxia lenses, the manual focus ones, and there's those Batis or Batis ones. There's all sorts going on, some really exciting optics in the FE mount, which is the Sony full frame mount. Really, really good stuff. So again, Canon's got to be really careful. But again, I know some people who just are very, very focused on that system. They love Canon. They're very comfortable with it. And certainly if you're comfortable with the 5D Mark III, I mean, I'm looking at them both again here, you're going to be so at home with the 5DS because they're essentially the same camera, but with different sensors. I mean, they handle almost identically. All the buttons are in the same place. I'm going to turn them around so you can see this one I'm waving is the 5DS. This one that I'm waving is the 5D Mark III. I mean, look, on the back, it's the same. Yeah. It's exactly the same. So you will be very much at home. And for some people, that's all they want. You've got to think back 3 years ago when the D810 came out and a lot of Canon owners went, oh, I just want a high-resolution body. And then the Sony bodies came out, oh, I still want a high-resolution body. But they didn't switch. This camera's for these people, the Canon faithful. And they've been rewarded with the highest resolution body that's currently on the market in this format. So, they can finally go, ha-ha, Nikon and Sony. And because Nikon generally uses Sony sensors, one would assume that the next Nikon full frame will also be 42 megapixel. This is just a guess, pure speculation, but That's what I would guess. So in that instance, Canon are going to enjoy that lead for their next generation, which in Canon and Nikon world is, of course, 2 or 3 years long. It's not like Sony or Panasonic or other consumer electronics companies that go, a year has gone, why haven't we released another 15 bodies? You know, Canon and Nikon are a much more leisurely product cycle. So these cameras are going to be good for a few years. And during that time, Canon people can go, yeah, we've got the highest resolution body. And as I say, when you look at the files from it, and we do have sample images at cameralabs.com, which I've taken under very careful conditions, they look fantastic. I mean, they're massive. The amount of detail in them is epic. And if that's what you want, then this camera will deliver it.
So one last thing before we leave this camera is, in looking at other online reviews, I've seen a lot of criticism of the image quality, specifically high ISO performance, dynamic range, color rendition. What's your feeling about that? Do you feel that this camera is up there in quality, or do you think it's inferior to some of these others on the market?
Well, when we recorded this video, I was actually halfway through my testing, and the only thing that I can comment on right now in this video is resolution. I have done all of my noise tests, but I haven't had a chance to analyze them yet. But one of the interesting things about the 5DS is that the maximum ISO is only 12,800, which is a lot less than the 5D Mark III, which went up to, 102,000. And interestingly, a lot lower than the 7D Mark II, which, again, as we mentioned, has roughly the same pixel pitch. So it's interesting that they've kept that maximum sensitivity down, I think, to avoid disappointment. I mean, it's not going to be, in terms of physics, it's not going to be a fantastic high ISO camera. It's not designed for that. And the same things that make a camera great at high ISOs are the same things that make it great in terms of dynamic range, which is big, fat pixel buckets. You know, if your pixels are small, it's technically harder for it to capture the same dynamic range and the same signal to noise ratio. So I'm not expecting it to be as good as other cameras in terms of total dynamic range or noise. It is a modern sensor, so perhaps it can stay up. I can't comment on that now, but I do know that by the time this video and podcast is available, I will have completed my results on the 5DS. So go to cameralabs.com for the follow-up, because you will see all of the results there fully analyzed against the 5D Mark III, and hopefully by then also against the A7R Mark II and maybe a Nikon and anything else I can get my hands on. Because for me, this test is all about quality. I'm not going to talk much about the handling or the body, because we know what that's like. It's all about the quality with this camera. So I'm going to be comparing it against many, many things, as many different things as possible, including the 5DSR as well. I'm going to do it in multiple chunks. So again, by the time you watch this video or hear this podcast, hopefully I will have a lot more information and results for you.
Oh, very good. I think we're all looking forward to that, and you did it for me. I don't have to tell people to go to cameralabs.com. Okay, so another thing that Nikon has had in their stable of goodies that a lot of people have loved for many years now is this terrific wide-angle zoom, the 14 to 24 f2.8 Nikkor lens. I have that lens. It is one of my absolute favorites. Apparently, Canon has something that's in the same ballpark. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Canon has always had a 16 to 35 millimeter 2.8, and that's now in the second edition. But they never had something as wide as 14 millimeter in a zoom. They, of course, have a fantastic 14 millimeter prime, again, in its second edition. But what they really liked was, a 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8, and that's what everyone wanted, because Nikon produced this lens, and obviously they had a meeting where they went, look, we don't care how big it is. We don't care how expensive or heavy it is. Just make it really, really good. And they did. It is extremely good. It's really, really sharp, even wide open across the frame at all focal lengths. It's a brilliant lens, which is why everyone buys it and adapts it to every other system, because it is quite unique. Canon, of course, however, have been missing a native version of this. So there's been so much speculation since that Nikon lens was released years ago. People actually it's fascinating. If you look at trademarks that have been registered and patents that have been registered, you can kind of get an idea of what some of the camera companies are planning, because people actually look at the patents for strange optical designs and then try and guess what sort of lens this might turn out to be in 5 years' time when they finally manufacture it. And after much waiting, the 11 to 24 millimeter came out, and I've got it here mounted on the 5DS. It's massive. It's bigger and heavier even than the Nikon 14 to 24. Now, one of the the most obvious difference is that it zooms wider. It zooms to 11 millimeter rather than 14. And remember, this is a full frame lens. So it's not like 11. So when you've got that on a crop sensor, it becomes, 18 or 22 mil. It's actually 11 millimeter on a full frame. It's massive. You get everything in. If you're into real estate, the tiniest room, you could photograph the inside of a cupboard and make it look palatial, make it look like a mansion. If you're shooting, same with the interiors of buildings and massive landscapes. I mean, its lens is unbelievable in its scope. However, one of the other big differences between this and the Nikon is the focal ratio. The Nikon is f2.8, whereas the Canon is f4, which also makes you think, wow, this really is a big and heavy lens considering it's just f4. But look at this element on the end. And this is a reason to watch the video rather than listening to the podcast, because I'm showing this beautiful bit of glass here. And as I zoom it, it's at 11 millimeter at the moment. So as I zoom it throughout the range, you'll see it. Oh, it's going in a bit. And that's as far as it goes in until it reaches 18 millimeter, and then it pops back out again a little bit. So it's at its most vulnerable when it's at 11 millimeter. Like most lenses of this design, there is no filter thread on the end, but third-party companies do produce solutions. I think there's one called LeCroix, I believe, has an adapter. If you're not already following him on Google Plus or Facebook, have a look at Barry Blanchard. He, I believe, has this lens and is a big fan of physical filters, and I think he's actually using a LeCroix filter system. So check out and see what he does. There may be some caveats. Maybe it doesn't work at 11 millimeter. I'm still finding out. It does, if I take it off, though, have a rear filter mount.
Oh, that's very nice.
You can slot in filters in the rear, and you'll also notice it has the little rubber bit around the edge there. That means it's weather sealed at the mount. So this is a nice tough lens, but it's absolutely gorgeous. I've again been testing this at all focal lengths and all apertures, and it's extremely sharp. It is exactly the right lens to be paired with the 5DS, but it's also perfect for any other Canon full frame body. It ain't cheap though. $3,000 in the US or 2,799 Great British pounds. It's considerably more expensive than the Nikon 14 to 24, while losing a stop in their aperture, but while gaining 3 millimeters at their wide end.
Yeah, that reminds me of the most important thing. Every time I hear about this lens, all I can think of is the movie This Is Spinal Tap, where of course but this one goes to 11.
It does, and that must have been what they were thinking. There it is. It goes all the way to 11.
All the way to 11. It must be louder, right?
It has to be better if it goes to 11.
Yeah.
But this combination here, I mean, wow! I've done quite well to hold this throughout most of this discussion, because we're looking at 2 kilograms for this combination here, which is quite a lot. And it's funny, when I have this in my f-stop ICU, it occupies almost the entire thing. And this is the same space that I currently take an Olympus OMD EM1, 7 lenses, and a Sony A6000 and the 70 to 200. The volume that occupies is approximately the same as this single combination. So, you've got to really, there was a time when I would have personally absolutely loved this combination, and there's no doubt that it produces amazing quality results. But I'm using smaller formats now. But this is quite a substantial thing to carry around with you. You certainly know you're carrying it.
Oh, that's good. Well, at least Canon shooters now have that lens. They don't have to make excuses any longer. Not only that, it goes all the way to 11 millimeters. So we love that. And
Doug, it is very important to have these options, because they're a bit like, they sell people into the format, because you may have no intention of buying a 50 megapixel camera. You may have no intention of buying an 11 to 24 millimeter zoom, but the fact that they exist in the system makes it a very exciting system. It makes you think, you know what, I may never buy them, but at least they're available. At least there's that option. So it encourages people to buy into it, even at a much, much lower level. So these two are very, very important products for Canon to have in their catalog, because prior to them coming out, they did not have a very high resolution body, and they did not have an ultra wide angle rectilinear lens. Now they've got that amazing fisheye zoom, the 8-15, which is a great product. And in fact, looks really, really small compared to this. It's a really compact lens. But, they didn't have one that was geometrically, perfect and corrected in this way. So it's very important for them to have these two products. And now, after trailing behind for a while, they've kind of jumped back ahead again. I just wish the 5DS could do 4K video and had Wi-Fi. Yeah. Hang on, that's the A7R Mark II.
Well, Gordon, thank you very much. It's been another very informative show. I feel like I've learned quite a bit. Again, to everyone watching or listening, I encourage you to go to cameralabs.com, where you'll see much greater detail, as well as Gordon's completed review of the Canon 5DS. And if you're interested in purchasing, I encourage you to use our Buy It Now links to help support the program. That's either for the Canon 11 to 24 f4 lens, or the Canon 5DS or 5DSR. Thanks again, Mr. Lang. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you, Mr. K. Always a pleasure.
Bye-bye.